This is the Courage of the Truth, lectures given by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1983-84, Part 1, First Hour. This year, I would like to continue with the theme of parrhesia, truth-telling, that I began to talk about last year. The lectures I would like to give will no doubt be somewhat disjointed because they deal with things that I would like to have done with, as it were, in order to return after this several years long Greco-Latin trip to some contemporary problems which I will deal with either in the second part of the course or possibly in the form of a working seminar. Well then, I shall remind you of something. You know that the rules are that the lectures of the college are and must be public. So it is quite right that anyone, French citizens or otherwise, has the right to come and listen to them. The college professors are obliged to report regularly on their research in these public lectures. However, this principle poses problems and raises a number of difficulties because the research one may undertake, especially with regard to questions like those I dealt with previously, and which I would now like to return, that is to say, the analysis of certain practices and institutions in modern society, increasingly involves collective work which, of course, can only be pursued in the form of a closed seminar, and not in a room like this and with such a large public. I am not going to hide from you the fact that I shall raise the problem of whether it is possible, whether it may be institutionally acceptable to divide the work I am doing here between public lectures, which once again are part of the job and of your rights, and lectures which would be restricted to small working groups with some students or researchers who have a more specialized interest in the question being studied. The public lectures would be, as it were, the exoteric version of the somewhat more esoteric work in a group. In any case, I don't know how many public lectures I will give or for how long. So if you like, let's get going and then we'll see. This year, I would like to continue the study of free spokenness, or of parrhesia as modality of truth-telling. I will restate the general idea for those of you who were not here last year. It is absolutely true that the analysis of the specific structures of those discourses which claim to be and are accepted as true discourse is both interesting and important. Broadly speaking, we could call the analysis of these structures an epistemological analysis. On the other hand, it seemed to me that it would be equally interesting to analyze the conditions and forms of the type of act by which the subject manifests himself when speaking the truth, by which I mean thinks of himself and is recognized by others as speaking the truth, rather than analyzing the forms by which a discourse is recognized as true. This would involve analyzing the form in which, in his act of telling the truth, the individual constitutes himself and is constituted by others as a subject of a discourse of truth. The form in which he presents himself to himself and to others as someone who tells the truth, the form of the subject telling the truth. In contrast with the study of epistemological structures, the analysis of this domain could be called the study of allithergic forms. I am using here a word which I commented on last year or 2 years ago. Etymologically, allithergy would be the production of truth, the act by which truth is manifested. So let's leave the kind of analysis which focuses on epistemological structure to one side and begin to analyze allithergic forms. This is the framework in which I am studying the notion and practice of parrhesia. But for those of you who were not here, I would like to recall how I arrived at this problem. I came to it from the old traditional question, which is at the very heart of Western philosophy, of the relations between subject and truth. A question which I posed, which I took up first of all in classical, usual, and traditional terms. That is to say, on the basis of what practices and through what types of discourse have we tried to tell the truth about the subject. Thus, on the basis of what practices, through what types of discourse, have we tried to tell the truth about the mad subject or the delinquent subject? On the basis of what discursive practices was the speaking, laboring, and living subject constituted as a possible object of knowledge? This was the field of study that I tried to cover for a period. And then I tried to envisage this same question of subject, truth, relations in another form, not that of the discourse of truth in which the truth about the subject can be told, but that of the discourse of truth which the subject is likely and able to speak about himself, which may be, for example, avowal, confession, or examination of conscience. This was the analysis of the subject's true discourse about himself, and it was easy to see the importance of this discourse for penal practices or in the domain of the experience of sexuality. This theme, this problem led me, in previous years' lectures, to attempt the historical analysis of practices of telling the truth about oneself. In undertaking this analysis, I noticed something completely unexpected. To be more precise, I shall say that it is easy to note the great importance of the principle that one should tell the truth about oneself in all of ancient morality and in Greek and Roman culture. In support and as illustration of the importance of this principle in ancient culture, we can cite such frequently, constantly, continually recommended practices as the examination of conscience, prescribed by the Pythagoreans or Stoics, of which Seneca provides such elaborate examples, and which are found again in Marcus Aurelius. We can also cite practices like correspondence, the exchange of moral, spiritual letters, examples of which can be found in Seneca, Pliny the Younger, Fronto, and Marcus Aurelius. We can also cite, again and as illustration of this principle, one should tell the truth about oneself. Other, perhaps less well-known practices, which have left fewer traces, like the notebooks, the kinds of journals which people were recommended to keep about themselves, either for the recollection and meditation of things one has experienced or read, or to record one's dreams when waking up. So it is quite easy to locate a very clear and solid set of practices in ancient culture which involve telling the truth about oneself. These practices are certainly not unknown, and I make no claim to having discovered them. That is not my intention. But I think there is a consistent tendency to analyze these forms of practices of telling the truth about oneself by relating them, as it were, to a central axis, which is, of course, and entirely legitimately, the Socratic principle of know yourself. They are then seen as the illustration, the implementation, the concrete exemplification of the principle of noti siouton. But I think it would be interesting to situate these practices in a broader context, defined by a principle of which the noti siouton is itself only an implication. This principle, I think I tried to bring this out in the lectures I gave 2 years ago, is that of epimelia hioutu, care of self, application to oneself. This precept, which is so archaic, so ancient in Greek and Roman culture, and which in Platonic texts, and more precisely in the Socratic dialogues, is regularly associated with the nothesioton, this principle epimule siuto, take care of yourself, gave rise, I think, to the development of what could be called a culture of self, in which a whole set of practices of self are formulated, developed, worked out, and transmitted. Studying these practices of self as the historical framework in which the injunction, one should tell the truth about oneself, developed, I saw a figure emerge who was constantly present as the indispensable partner, at any rate the almost necessary helper, in this obligation to tell the truth about oneself. To put it more clearly and concretely, I shall say, we do not have to wait until Christianity, until the institutionalization of the confession at the start of the 13th century, until the organization and installation of a pastoral power for the practice of telling the truth about oneself, to rely upon and appeal to the presence of the other person who listens and enjoins one to speak, and who speaks himself. In ancient culture, and therefore well before Christianity, telling the truth about oneself was an activity involving several people, an activity with other people, and even more precisely, an activity with one other person, a practice for two. And it was this other person who was present, and necessarily present in the practice of telling the truth about oneself, which caught and held my attention. The status and presence of this other person, who is so necessary for me to be able to tell the truth about myself, obviously, poses some problems. It is not so easy to analyze. For if it is true that we are relatively familiar with the other who is necessary for telling the truth about oneself in Christian culture, in which he takes the institutional form of the confessor or the spiritual director, and if it is fairly easy to spot this other person in modern culture, whose status and functions should no doubt be analyzed more precisely, this other person who is indispensable for me to be able to tell the truth about myself whether in the role of doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, or psychoanalyst. On the other hand, in ancient culture, whether this role is nevertheless well attested, we have to acknowledge that its status is much more variable, vague, much less clear-cut and institutionalized. In ancient culture, this other who is necessary for me to be able to tell the truth about myself might be a professional philosopher, but he could be anybody. You recall, for example, the passage in Galen on the cure of errors and passions, in which he says that to tell the truth about oneself and to know oneself, we need someone else whom we can pick up almost anywhere, so long as he is old enough and serious. This person may be a professional philosopher, or he may be just anybody. He may be a teacher who is more or less part of an institutionalized pedagogical structure. Epictetus directed a school, but he may be a personal friend or a lover. He may be a provisional guide for a young man who is not yet fully mature, who has not yet made his basic choices in life, who is not yet the full master of himself. But he may also be a permanent advisor who will accompany someone throughout his life and guide him until death. You recall, for example, the cynic Demetrius, who was the counselor of Thrasea-Paetus, an important figure in Roman political life in the middle of the 1st century, and who served him as counselor until the day of his death, until his suicide. Since Demetrius was present at the suicide of Thrasea-Paetus and conversed with him until his last breath about the immortality of the soul, naturally in the manner of the Socratic dialogue. The status of this other person is variable, therefore, nor is it any easier to isolate and define his role, his practice, since, in one respect, it is connected with the leans on pedagogy, but it is also guidance of the soul. It may also be a sort of political advice. But equally, the role may be presented metaphorically and even manifest itself and take shape as a sort medical practice, since it is a question of taking care of the soul and of fixing a regimen of life, which includes, of course, the regimen of passions, but also the dietary regimen, and the mode of life in all its aspects. However, even if the role of this other person, who is indispensable for telling the truth about oneself, is uncertain, or, if you like, polyvalent, even if it appears with a number of different aspects and profiles, medical, political, and pedagogical, which mean that it is not always easy to grasp exactly what his role is. Even so, whatever his role, status, function, and profile may be, this other has, or rather should have, a particular kind of qualification in order to be the real and effective partner of truth-telling about self. And this qualification, unlike the confessors or spiritual directors in Christian culture, is not given by an institution and does not refer to the possession and exercise of specific spiritual powers. Nor is it, as in modern culture, an institutional qualification guaranteeing a psychological, psychiatric, or psychoanalytic knowledge. The qualification required by this uncertain, rather vague, and variable character is a practice, a certain way of speaking which is called precisely parrhesia, free-spokenness. To be sure, it has now become quite difficult for us to recapture this notion of parrhesia, of speaking out freely, constitutive of the figure of this other person, who is indispensable for me to be able to tell the truth about myself. But it has nonetheless left many traces in the Latin and Greek texts. In the first place, it has obviously left traces in the fairly frequent use of the word, and then also through references to the notion even when the word itself is not used. We find many examples in Seneca in particular, where the practice of parrhesia is very clearly picked out in descriptions and characterizations, practically without the word being used, if only because of the difficulties the Latins had translating the word parrhesia itself. Apart from these occurrences of the word or references to the notion, there are also some texts which are more or less wholly devoted to the notion of parrhesia. From the 1st century before Jesus Christ, there is the text of the Epicurean Philodemus, who wrote a Parrhesia, a large part of which is sadly lost. But there is also Plutarch's treatise, How to Distinguish the Flatterer from the Friend, which is entirely taken up with an analysis of parrhesia. or rather, of the two opposed, conflicting practices of flattery on the one hand, and parrhesia, free-spokenness, on the other. There is Galen's text, which I referred to a moment ago, on the cure of errors and passions, in which a whole section is devoted to parrhesia and to the choice of the person who is rightly qualified as being able and having to use this free-spokenness so that the individual can, in turn, tell the truth about himself and constitute himself as subject telling the truth about himself. So this is how I was led to focus on this notion of parrhesia as a constitutive component of truth-telling about self, or, more precisely, as the element which qualifies the other person who is necessary in the game and obligation of speaking the truth about self. You may recall that last year I undertook the analysis of this free-spokenness, of the practice of parrhesia, and of the character able to employ parrhesia, who is called the parrhesiast. The word appears later. The study of parrhesia and of the parrhesiast in the culture of self in antiquity is obviously a sort of prehistory of those practices which are organized and developed later around some famous couples, the penitent and the confessor, the person being guided, and the spiritual director, the sick person and the psychiatrist, the patient and the psychoanalyst. It was, in a sense, this prehistory that I was trying to write. Only then, while studying this parrhesiastic practice in this perspective, as the prehistory of these famous couples, I became aware again of something which rather surprised me and which I had not foreseen. Although parrhesia is an important notion in the domain of spiritual direction, spiritual guidance, or soul counseling, and however important it may be in Hellenistic and Roman literature in particular, it is important to recognize that its origin lies elsewhere, that it is not essentially, fundamentally, or primarily in the practice of spiritual guidance that it emerges. Last year, I tried to show you that the notion of parrhesia was first of all and fundamentally a political notion. And this analysis of parrhesia as a political notion, as a political concept, clearly took me away somewhat from my immediate project. the ancient history of practices of telling the truth about oneself. However, on the other hand, this drawback was compensated for by the fact that by taking up again or undertaking the analysis of parrhesia in the field of political practices, I drew a bit closer to a theme which, after all, has always been present in my analysis of the relations between the subject and truth, that of relations of power and their role in the interplay between the subject and truth. Then, with the notion of parrhesia, originally rooted in political practice and the problematization of democracy, then later diverging towards the sphere of personal ethics and the formation of the moral subject. With this notion, with political roots and its divergence into morality, we have, to put things very schematically, and this is what interested me, why I stopped to look at this and am still focusing on it. The possibility of posing the question of the subject and truth from the point of view of the practice of what could be called the government of oneself and others. And thus we come back to the theme of government, which I studied some years ago. It seems to me that by examining the notion of parrhesia, we can see how the analysis of modes of veridiction, the study of techniques of governmentality, and the identification of forms of practice of self interweave, connecting together modes of veridiction, techniques of governmentality, and practices of the self is basically what I have always been trying to do. And to the extent that this involves the analysis of relations between modes of veridiction, techniques of governmentality, and forms of practice of self, you can see that to depict this kind of research as an attempt to reduce knowledge to power, to make it the mask of power in structures where there is no place for a subject, is purely and simply a caricature. What is involved, rather, is the analysis of complex relations between three distinct elements, none of which can be reduced to or absorbed by the others, but whose relations are constitutive of each other. These three elements are forms of knowledge, studied in terms of their specific modes of veridiction, relations of power, not studied as an emanation of a substantial and invasive power, but in the procedures by which people's conduct is governed. And finally, the modes of formation of the subject through practices of self. It seems to me that by carrying out this triple theoretical shift from the theme of acquired knowledge to that of veridiction, from the theme of domination to that of governmentality, and from the theme of the individual to that of the practices of self, we can study the relations between truth, power, and subject without ever reducing each of them to the others. Now, having recalled this general trajectory, which I would like to mention briefly some of the essential elements which characterize parrhesia and the parrhesiastic role. Very briefly, for a few minutes, and once again, for the benefit of those who were not here, I shall go back over some things I have already said. I apologize to those who will be hearing this again. And then I would like, as quickly as possible, to move on to another way of envisaging the same notion of parrhesia. You recall that etymologically, parrhesia is the activity that consists in saying everything. Panrima, parrhesiaste, is telling all. The parrhesiast is the person who says everything. Thus, as an example, in his discourse on the embassy, Demosthenes says, "It is necessary to speak with parrhesia, without holding back anything, without concealing anything." Similarly, in the first Philippic, he takes up exactly the same term and says, "I will tell you what I think without concealing anything." The parrhesiast is the person who tells all. But we should immediately add the clarification that this word parrhesia may be employed with two values. I think we find it used in a pejorative sense. First in Aristophanes, and afterwards in commonly even in Christian literature. Used in a pejorative sense, parrhesia does not indeed consist in saying everything. but in the sense of saying anything. Anything that comes to mind, anything that serves the cause one is defending. Anything that serves the passion or interest driving the person who is speaking. The parrhesiast then becomes and appears as the impenitent chatterbox. Someone who cannot restrain himself, or at any rate, someone who cannot link his discourse to a principle of rationality and truth. There is an example of this use of the term parrhesia in a pejorative sense, saying everything, saying anything, saying whatever comes to mind, without reference to any principle of reason or truth. In Isocrates, in the discourse entitled Basiris, in which Isocrates says that, unlike the poets, who ascribe everything and anything, absolutely every and any qualities and defects to the gods, one should not say everything about them. Similarly, in Book 8 of the Republic, I will give you the exact reference shortly because I will come back to this text. There is the description of the bad democratic city, which is all motley, fragmented, and dispersed between different interests, passions, and individuals who do not agree with each other. This bad democratic city practices parrhesia. Anyone can say anything. But the word parrhesia is also employed in a positive sense. And then parrhesia consists in telling the truth without concealment, reserve, empty manner of speech, or rhetorical ornament which might encode or hide it. Telling all is then telling the truth without hiding any part of it, without hiding it behind anything. In the second Philippic, Demosthenes thus says that unlike bad parrhesiasts who say anything and do not index their discourse to reason, he, Demosthenes, does not want to speak without reason. He does not want to resort to insults and exchange blow for blow. You know, these infamous disputes in which anything is said so long as it may harm the adversary and be useful to one's own cause. He does not want to do this, but rather he wants to tell the truth. Ta alethi, things that are true. With parrhesia, meta parrhesias. Moreover, he adds, I will conceal nothing. to hide nothing, and say what is true, is to practice parrhesia. Parrhesia is therefore telling all, but tied to the truth. Telling the whole truth, hiding nothing of the truth. Telling the truth without hiding it behind anything. However, I don't think this suffices as a description and definition of this notion of parrhesia. In fact, leaving aside the negative senses of the term for the moment, in addition to the rule of telling all and the rule of truth, two supplementary conditions are required for us to be able to speak of parrhesia in the positive sense of the term. Not only must this truth really be the personal opinion of the person who is speaking, but he must say it as being what he thinks, and not reluctantly. And this is what makes him a parrhesiast. The parrhesiast gives his opinion. He says what he thinks. He personally signs, as it were, the truth he states. He binds himself to this truth, and he is consequently bound to it and by it. But this is not enough. For, after all, a teacher, a grammarian, or a geometer may say something true about the grammar or geometry they teach. A truth which they believe, which they think. And yet we will not call this parrhesia. We will not say that the geometer and the grammarian are parrhesiasts when they teach truths which they believe. For there to be parrhesia, you recall, I stressed this last year, the subject must be taking some kind of risk in speaking. This truth which he signs as his opinion, his thought, his belief, a risk which concerns his relationship with the person to whom he is speaking. For there to be parrhesia, in speaking the truth, one must open up, establish, and confront the risk of offending the other person, of irritating him, of making him angry, and provoking him to conduct which may even be extremely violent. So it is the truth subject to risk of violence. For example, in the first Philippic, after having said that he is speaking metaparrhesias, with frankness, Demosthenes adds, I am well aware that, by employing this frankness, I do not know what the consequences will be for me of the things I have just said. In short, parrhesia, the act of truth, requires, first, the manifestation of a fundamental bond between the truth spoken and the thought of the person who spoke it. Second, a challenge to the bond between the two interlocutors the person who speaks the truth, and the person to whom this truth is addressed. Hence, this new feature of parrhesia it involves some form of courage, the minimal form of which consists in the parrhesiast taking the risk of breaking and ending the relationship to the other person, which was precisely what made his discourse possible. In a way, the parrhesiast always risks undermining that relationship, which is the condition of possibility of his discourse. This is very clear in parrhesia as spiritual guidance. For example, which can only exist if there is a friendship, and where the employment of truth in this spiritual guidance is precisely in danger of bringing into question and breaking the relationship of friendship, which made this discourse of truth possible. But in some cases, this courage may also take a maximal form when one has to accept that, if one is to tell the truth, not only may one's personal friendly relationship with the person to whom one is speaking be brought into question, but one may even be risking one's life. When Plato goes to see Dionysus the Elder, this is recounted in Plutarch. He tells him truths which so offend the tyrant that he conceives the plan, which in fact he does not put into execution, of killing Plato. But Plato fundamentally knew and accepted this risk. Parrhesia, therefore, not only puts the relationship between the person who speaks and the person to whom he addresses the truth at risk, but it may go so far as to put the very life of the person who speaks at risk. At least, if his interlocutor has power over him and cannot bear being told the truth. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle lays stress on the connection between parrhesia and courage when he links what he calls megalopsuchia, greatness of the soul, to the practice of parrhesia. Only, and this is the last feature I would like to recall briefly, parrhesia may be organized, developed, and stabilized into what could be called a parrhesiatic game. For if the parrhesiast is someone who, by telling the truth, the whole truth, regardless of any other consideration, risks bringing his relationship to the other into question, and even risks his life. On the other hand, the person to whom this truth is told whether this is the assembled people deliberating on the best decisions to take, or the prince, the tyrant or king to whom advice must be given, or the friend one is guiding. This person, people, king, friend, if he wants to play the role proposed to him by the parrhesiast in telling him the truth, must accept the truth. However much it may hurt generally accepted opinion in the assembly, however much it may hurt generally accepted opinion in the assembly, the prince's passions or interests, or the individual's ignorance or blindness. The people, the prince, and the individual must accept the game of parrhesia. They must play it themselves and recognize that they have to listen to the person who takes the risk of telling them the truth. Thus, the true game of parrhesia will be established on the basis of this kind of pact, which means that if the parrhesiast demonstrates his courage by telling the truth despite and regardless of everything, the person to whom this parrhesia is addressed will have to demonstrate his greatness of soul by accepting being told the truth. This kind of pact between the person who takes the risk of telling the truth and the person who agrees to listen to it is at the heart of what could be called the parrhesiastic game. So in 2 words, parrhesia is the courage of the truth in the person who speaks and who, regardless of everything, takes the risk of telling the whole truth that he thinks. But it is also the interlocutor's courage in agreeing to accept the hurtful truth that he hears. You can see then how the practice of parrhesia is opposed to the art of rhetoric in every respect. Very schematically, we can say that rhetoric, as it was defined and practiced in antiquity, is basically a technique concerning the way that things are said. But does not in any way determine the relations between the person who speaks and what he says. Rhetoric is an art, a technique, a set of processes which enable the person speaking to say something which may not be what he thinks at all, but whose effect will be to produce convictions, induce certain conducts, or instills certain beliefs in the person to whom he speaks. In other words, rhetoric does not involve any bond of belief between the person speaking and what he states. The good rhetorician, the good rhetor, is the man who may well say, and who is perfectly capable of saying, something completely different from what he knows, believes, and thinks, but of saying it in such a way that, in the final analysis, what he says, which is not what he believes, thinks, or knows, becomes what those he has spoken to think, believe, and think they know. The connection between the person speaking and what he says is broken in rhetoric. But the effect of rhetoric is to establish a constraining bond between what is said and the person or persons to whom it is said. You can see that from this point of view. Rhetoric is the exact opposite of parrhesia, which entails, on the contrary, a strong, manifest, evident foundation between the person speaking and what he says, since he must openly express his thought. And you can see that in parrhesia there is no question of saying anything other than what one thinks. Parrhesia, therefore, establishes a strong, necessary, and constitutive bond between the person speaking and what he says. But it exposes to risk the bond between the person speaking and the person to whom he speaks. For after all, it is always possible that the person to whom one is speaking will not welcome what one says. He may take offense at what one says. He may reject it and even punish or take revenge on the person who has told him the truth. So, rhetoric does not entail any bond between the person speaking and what is said, but aims to establish a constraining bond, a bond of power between what is said and the person to whom it is said. Parrhesia, on the other hand, involves a strong and constitutive bond between the person speaking and what he says, and through the effect of the truth, of the injuries of truth, it opens up the possibility of the bond between the person speaking and the person to whom he has spoken being broken. Let's say, very schematically, that the rhetorician is, or at any rate, may well be an effective liar, who constrains others. The parrhesia on the contrary, is the courageous teller of a truth by which he puts himself and his relationship with the other at risk. These are all things which I spoke to you about last year. I would like now to move on a bit and note straight away that we should not think of parrhesia as a sort of well-defined technique in a counterbalancing and symmetrical relation to rhetoric. We should not think that in antiquity, facing the rhetorician who was a professional, a technician, and facing rhetoric, which was a technique and required an apprenticeship, there was a parrhesiast and a parrhesia which would also be. The parrhesiast is not a professional. And parrhesia is, after all, something other than a technique or a skill. Although it has technical aspects, parrhesia is not a skill. It is something which is harder to define. It is a stance, a way of being, which is akin to a virtue, a mode of action. Parrhesia involves ways of acting, means brought together with a view to an end. And in this respect, it has, of course, something to do with technique. But it is also a role which is useful, valuable, and indispensable for the city and for individuals. Parrhesia should be regarded as a modality of truth-telling, rather than as a technique like rhetoric. To arrive at a better definition, we can contrast it with other basic modalities of truth-telling found in antiquity, and which will no doubt be found in displaced and different guises and forms in other societies, as well as our own. Basing ourselves on the clear understandings which antiquity has left us about these things, we may define 4 basic modalities of truth-telling. First, the truth-telling of prophecy. I will not try here to analyze what the prophets said, the structures, as it were, of what was said by prophets, but rather the way in which the prophet constitutes himself and is recognized by others as a subject speaking the truth. Evidently, the prophet, like the parrhesiast, is someone who tells the truth. But I think that what fundamentally characterizes the prophet's truth-telling, his veridiction, is that the prophet's posture is one of mediation. The prophet, by definition, does not speak in his own name. He speaks for another voice. His mouth serves as intermediary for a voice which speaks from elsewhere. the prophet usually transmits the Word of God. The discourse he articulates and utters is not his own. He addresses a truth to men which comes from elsewhere. The prophet's position is intermediary in another sense, in that he is between the present and the future. The second characteristic of the prophet's intermediary position is that he reveals what time conceals from humans. What no human gaze could see and no human ear could hear without him. Prophetic truth-telling is also intermediary in that. In one way, of course, the prophet reveals, shows, or sheds light on what is hidden from men. But in another way, on rather at the same time, he does not reveal without being obscure, and he does not disclose without enveloping what he says in the form of a riddle. Hence, prophecy basically never gives any univocal and clear prescription. It does not bluntly speak the pure, transparent truth. Even when the prophet says what is to be done, one still has to ask oneself whether one has really understood, whether one may not still be blind. One still has to question, hesitate, and interpret. Now, parousia contrasts with these different characteristics of prophetic truth-telling in each of these precise respects. You can see then that the parousiast is in the opposite of the prophet, in that the prophet does not speak for himself, but in the name of someone else. And he articulates a voice which is not his own. In contrast, the parousiast, by definition, speaks in his own name. It is essential that he expresses his own opinion, thought, and conviction. He must put his name to his words. This is the price of his frankness. The prophet does not have to be frank, even when he tells the truth. Second, the parousiast does not foretell the future. Certainly, he reveals and discloses what people's blindness prevents them from seeing. But he does not unveil the future. He unveils what is. The parousiast does not help people somehow to step beyond some threshold in the ontological structure of the human being and of time which separates them from their future. He helps them in their blindness. But their blindness about what they are, about themselves. And so not the blindness due to an ontological structure, but due to some moral fault, distraction, or lack of discipline, the consequence of inattention, laxity, or weakness. It is in this interplay between human beings and their blindness due to inattention, complacency, weakness, and moral distraction that the Parrhesius performs his role, which, as you can see, is consequently a revelatory role very different from that of a prophet, who stands at the point where human finitude and the structure of time are conjoined. Third, the Parrhesiast, again by definition, and unlike the prophet, does not speak in riddles. On the contrary, he says things as clearly and directly as possible, without any disguise or rhetorical embellishments, so that his words may immediately be given their prescriptive value. The Parrhesiast leaves nothing to interpretation. Certainly, he leaves something to be done. He leaves the person he addresses with the tough task of having the courage to accept this truth, to recognize it, and to make it a principle of conduct. He leaves this moral task, but unlike the prophet, he does not leave the difficult duty of interpretation. Second, I think we can also contrast Parrhesiastic truth-telling with another mode of truth-telling, which was very important in antiquity. Doubtless even more important for ancient philosophy than prophetic truth-telling. The truth-telling of wisdom. As you know, the sage, and in this he is unlike the prophet we have just been talking about, speaks in his own name. And even if this wisdom may have been inspired by a god, or passed on to him by a tradition, by a more or less esoteric teaching, the sage is nevertheless present in what he says, present in his truth-telling. The wisdom he expresses really is his own wisdom. The sage manifests his mode of being wise in what he says, and to that extent, although he has a certain intermediary function between timeless, traditional wisdom and the person he addresses, unlike the prophet, he is not just a mouthpiece. He is himself wise, a sage in his mode of being wise, as his personal mode of being qualifies him as a sage, and qualifies him to speak the discourse of wisdom. To that extent, insofar as he is present in his wise discourse and manifests his mode of being wise in his wise discourse, he is much closer to the Parrhesiast than to the prophet. But the sage, and this is what characterizes him, at least through some of the traits that we can find in the ancient literature, keeps his wisdom in a state of essential withdrawal, or at least reserve. Basically, the sage is wise in and for himself and does not need to speak. He is not forced to speak. Nothing obliges him to share his wisdom, to teach it, or demonstrate it. This accounts for what might be termed his structural silence. And if he speaks, it is only because he has appealed to by someone's questions or by an urgent situation of the city. This also explains why his answers, and then in this respect, he may well be like the prophet and often imitate and speak like him, may well be enigmatic and leave those he addresses ignorant or uncertain about what he has actually said. Another characteristic of the truth-telling of wisdom is that wisdom says what is, unlike prophecy where what is said is what will be. The sage says what is. That is to say, he tells of the being of the world and of things. And if this telling the truth of the being of the world and of things has a prescriptive value, it is not in the form of advice linked to a conjecture, but in the form of a general principle of conduct. These characteristics of the sage can be read and rediscovered in the text in which Diogenes Laertius portrays Heraclitus. It is a late text, but one of the richest in various kinds of information. First, Heraclitus lived in an essential withdrawal. He lived in silence. And Diogenes Laertius recalls the moment at which and why the break took place between Heraclitus and the Ephesians. The Ephesians had exiled his friend Hermodorus precisely because he was wise and better than them. They said, "We want there to be no one among us who is better than us. And if there is someone who is better than us, let him go and live elsewhere." The Ephesians could not bear the superiority of precisely someone who tells the truth. They drove out the Parrhesiast. They drove out Hermodorus, who was obliged to leave, forced into the exile, with which they punished the person capable of telling the truth. Heraclitus, for his part, responded with voluntary withdrawal, since the Ephesians have punished the best among them with exile. Well, he says, all the others who are less worthy should be put to death. And since they are not put to death, I will be the one to leave. And from that time, when asked to give laws to the city, he refused. Because, he says, the city is already dominated by a ponera politia, a bad mode of political life. So he withdraws himself, and in a famous image plays knuckle bones with children. To those who are indignant at him playing knuckle bones with children, he replies, "Why are you surprised, rascals? Isn't this more worthwhile than administering the republic with you? Than conducting political life with you?" He retires to the mountains, practicing contempt of men. And when asked why he remained silent, he replied, "I keep quiet so that you may chatter." Diogenes Laertius relates that in this retirement, Heraclitus wrote his poem in deliberately obscure terms so that only those who were capable could read it, and so that he, Heraclitus, could not be despised for being read by all and sundry. The figure and characteristics of the Parrhesiast stand in contrast with this role. This characterization of the sage, who basically remains silent, only speaks when he really wants to, and only in riddles. The Parrhesiast is not someone who is fundamentally reserved. On the contrary, it is his duty, obligation, responsibility, and task to speak, and he has no right to shirk this task. We will see this precisely with Socrates, who recalls it frequently in the Apology. The God has given him this office of stopping men, taking them aside, and questioning them. And he will never abandon this office, even under the threat of death. He will carry out his task until the end, until his final breath. Whereas the sage keeps silent and responds only sparingly, as little as possible, to the questions he may be asked. The Parrhesiast is the unlimited, permanent, unbearable questioner. Second, whereas the sage is the person who, against the background of an essential silence, speaks in riddles, the Parrhesiast must speak, and he must speak as clearly as possible. And finally, whereas the sage says what is, but in the form of the very being of things and of the world, Parrhesiast intervenes, says what is, but in terms of the singularity of individuals, situations, and conjectures. His specific role is not to tell of the being of nature and things. In the analysis of Parrhesia, we will constantly find this opposition between useless knowledge, which speaks of the being of things and of the world, on the one hand, and on the other, the Parrhesiast truth-telling which is always applied, questions, and is directed to individuals and situations in order to say what they are in reality, to tell individuals the truth of themselves, hidden from their own eyes, to reveal to them their present situation, their character, failings, the value of their conduct, and the possible consequences of their decisions. The parrhesiast does not reveal what is to his interlocutor. He discloses or helps him to recognize what he is. So the parrhesiast does not reveal what is to his interlocutor. He discloses or helps him to recognize what he is. Finally, the third modality of truth-telling, which can be contrasted with the parrhesiast truth-telling, is that of the professor, the technician, the teacher, the prophet, the sage, the person who teaches. Okay, that's the end of part 1, first hour of part 1 from the Courage of Truth lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1983-84.